when I'm talking to people in the United States about where I grew up, like the reaction 100% of the time is there are Indian people in West Virginia, right? There's just like total disbelief about the fact, even though I'm like, yes, that's where I'm from. It's like, I'm a liar. That can't be. No one knows about that thing. That's not possible, right?
We're everywhere.
So like, there's like, right, seriously, literally everywhere. Have you seen Mississippi masala? Come on, like we're in the Delta, damn it.
Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Queer Everything, a queer of color podcast about thriving in the world while being at odds with it. I'm Lena Rafiq Sheikh. In this episode, I'm thrilled to be speaking to someone for whom I have a lot of admiration, Boston-based educator, author, and activist Neema Avashia. Neema and I went to college together, but hadn't really talked since then, even though we lived in the same city for a number of years. Like me, Neema is queer and originally from South Asia. She's of Indian origin. She teaches civics in the Boston public school system and frequently offers her perspective as an educator on local media, most recently on the challenges facing teachers and students during the pandemic. She's also a writer. Her collection of personal essays, Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, is due out on March 1st of this year. This is part one of our conversation, in which she reflects on growing up queer and brown in West Virginia, exploring questions of identity and place through her writing, and coming out to her family. There's so much that I related to in her experience, and I'm delighted to be sharing the first part of this interview with you. And we're recording. I'm really excited to be speaking with you today, Neema. In some ways, we go way back, and also in some ways, we've been on each other's periphery for quite a long time. You came to mind because of the book that you're writing. When I was thinking about doing this podcast series, I'm interested generally in questions about identity and how people came to the things that they identify with. And especially in people for whom the question of identity is generally more complicated than just answering questions like, who are you and where are you from? How do we make meaning? What does it mean for us and how we show up in the world and what we do in the world? So before we start, Neema, I'd love to have you introduce yourself briefly.
Sure. So my name is Neema Avashia, and I am the child of Indian immigrants. My family immigrated from the state of Gujarat in India to southern West Virginia. My dad went to work in Union Carbide, which is a major chemical plant at the time, which was located, their main site was located in West Virginia. So I grew up in Appalachia, was there from birth to 18, and then I went to college at Carnegie Mellon, which is where I met Lena. I went to grad school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I studied education policy. I realized I didn't want to be a policymaker and that I wanted to be an educator instead. And so then I moved to Boston, and I've been a teacher in the Boston Public Schools since 2003. And in addition to teaching, I also am a writer, a personal essayist, and my first collection of essays is coming out in the spring. It's called Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place. And I hope you read it.
Wonderful. I had the opportunity to peruse what I thought was going to be a sampling of articles on your site, and that turned into every single one on your site. You are a beautiful and evocative and clear writer, and I'd love to talk with you about that today as we move along in our conversation. And I noticed a lot of what you write about. Well, I noticed a tension in your writing, which was something that I quite deeply related to. This unease, this sense of being caught between two and sometimes more worlds, being able to see deeply into both or all of them, and also finding yourself in the middle and having to make sense of it. So I'd love to start with the question of identity and how you thought about that maybe when you were younger.
I think that growing up, my prevailing notion of identity was just one of not really fitting really anywhere. When I was at school, the schools I attended were majority white schools. I was often the only student of color in my class or in my grade. And so there was this just clear sense that I didn't match with the people around me. And then there were also pretty aggressive messages about not matching and not belonging. I was 6 the first time I got called the N-word. So very early in my memory is this message of like, you don't fit here, you don't belong here. But then kind of at the same time, like in the context of the Indian community where I grew up, which there was a very small Indian community, there were about 100 families that lived in about a 45-minute radius of each other. And we would see each other a lot, like pretty much every weekend was an opportunity to kind of be immersed in and connected to people who shared my ethnic identity. But I also often didn't feel like I fit there. I was looking at like pictures from growing up a few weeks ago, and I was kind of laughing because we would do these Diwali celebrations, and if there was a boy role, like I always wanted to play it, right? And I'm like, like that's kind of an interesting choice. And when we had to dress up, like I wanted to wear boy outfits, I didn't want to wear the girls' outfits. And I played basketball, and like most of my Indian peers didn't do that. And as I started to write and I started to be interested in teaching, like the aunties and uncles were all like, this is not what our kids do. Like our kids are doctors and our kids are lawyers and our kids are engineers. Like our kids aren't teachers and they're not writers. So a lot of identity formation for me was like in opposition or in isolation, without a lot of models or mirrors. I was sort of just like, okay, I'm not any of these things. I'm none of the things. Or maybe I'm like a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but like my full self isn't represented in any of these spaces. So it's going to be a lot of trying to figure out how do I put these pieces together in order to be a full self. Integrating like all the distinct elements of identity, those like individual pieces. Like I grew up playing the guitar and I play Appalachian folk music on my guitar, and I might be one of like 5 Indian people in the world who plays Appalachian folk music on their guitar, right? Like that's kind of how I think about identity is like, okay, there's maybe 3 of me or there's maybe 5 of me and I don't really know the rest of them. I'm sure they're out there, but we don't know each other. So I'm just going to kind of have to pull and parse and figure out what this all means for me.
I'm hearing you talk about not quite fitting in the world outside and also not quite fitting with your family. What was it like to buck expectations and choose a different path?
It's funny because I don't like remember a time when I didn't. Like even things like wearing dresses. Like I was really little when I started to be like, nope, I'm not doing that. I don't want to do it. And I think I just sort of, in some ways, did develop a very oppositional orientation to the world. And kind of with my family, I think, I'm a lot younger than my older sister. She's 7 years older than I am. And I think my parents were very surprised by the difference between us. Like she was the older, she went first. She had all the burden that comes with being the older. And she was very compliant and she was really obedient and she did the right thing all the time. And then there was me. And I was sort of I would neither ask forgiveness nor permission. Like I just did things. And I think it just like, there just was this sort of sense in my family of like, yeah, we don't know what we're going to do about this person. Like they don't listen to us and they're not being violent and they're not being dangerous. So I guess we're just going to kind of let them do their thing because nothing we're doing works. Like punishment doesn't work. Like the things that I think my parents had as tools available to them didn't work for me. When I was little and I misbehaved, my parents would try to like put me in my room and I would proceed to like dump out all the furniture. I would dump out all the drawers. I'd empty the closets. I'd like pile everything in the middle of the room, right? And I was too small to put it all away. And so they, in some ways, got the message very early that, like, this is not going to work. Like, we're going to end up creating more mess for ourselves if we try to manage this person. So let them just manage themselves. And we will, like, make sure they don't set things on fire or harm themselves. But we're not going to play a very active role in, like, trying to get them to do things because it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think in general, my family's approach to me has always been like, okay, like, I guess you're doing what you're doing. And as long as you're okay, like, we're just going to, like, watch it play out. And in some ways, like, I'm really appreciative of that. Like, I think a lot of people don't have that space to just figure it out. And they did give me that space. They couldn't give me models, but they definitely gave me space.
That's another point on which I feel a lot of resonance because I think my parents gave up on me after a point. It's interesting to me, and I want to talk about this a little later, that we didn't connect over that in college. Because I think that there was a lot of parallels in our experience, and that if I'd known what I know now, if we knew maybe each other the way that we know now, that might have been different.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think that, I mean, I can't speak for your experience at college, but I actually think some of that, like identifying in opposition, continued for me when I went to college. Because going to college was the first time when there was like this really significant community of Desi people. But like very, very quickly, like I felt like I don't know those people. Like that's not, like I don't recognize the way that they're being with each other, and the way they want me to be is not recognizable to me. So I think I did a lot of like rejecting of spaces. I think there was a lot of rejecting of spaces just in general. That made it so like I don't think I necessarily then was able to like find the avenues of connection with other people who might also have been rejecting those spaces, or might have also been skeptical towards those spaces, because I kind of was just like hard no to all of it. And I do wonder if things would have been different, like to have peers along the way who were kind of working through the same things I was working through. I think it would have made a big difference. Hindsight is 2020, obviously, but I do think that like there were other ways to figure out who I was besides just rejecting everything. Right? There were other possibilities, but rejection was just the one that I landed on, and you know it served me moderately well. But like I think there could have been better ways.
I hear that. And as you're speaking, I'm also thinking about what somebody told me, somebody from our part of the world who is also queer, said about queerness being a buffer against certain things, right? Certainly against just sort of going along with expectations. So that's what I'm hearing as you speak, and as I also think about the things that you have done and are doing since. So I'm curious, when people ask about, how you grew up, and I say this as somebody who has a lot of trouble explaining the context from which I came, because people don't have a good sense of it. And so I have to, it's at least 3 or 4 sentences when I do.
Mine's a book.
Yeah, exactly. Yours is now a book. So what do you say to people, or what have you said to people, or how have you navigated that? And what do you say to people who are, say, from America, quote unquote, whatever that means, as opposed to people from our part of the world, as opposed to other folks?
I think the answer I would give you is that it really depends on who I'm talking to, and it depends on what they know. When I'm talking to people in the United States about where I grew up, like the reaction 100% of the time is there are Indian people in West Virginia, right? There's just like total disbelief about the fact, even though I'm like, yes, that's where I'm from. It's like, I'm a liar. That can't be. No one knows about that thing. That's not possible, right?
We're everywhere.
So like, there's like, right, seriously, literally everywhere. Have you seen Mississippi masala? Come on, like we're in the Delta, damn it. But there's that disbelief that you're sort of talking into, right? Of like trying to figure out how to help people understand and explain to them, like, how did this happen? That there's this small Indian community in rural West Virginia. I think when I'm talking to people from India, which to be honest happens less and less, for them, that geography is really irrelevant. Like, they're not thinking, oh, West Virginia. Like, there's no association with that. Unless they've been there, they have no association with that. And they've only been there if they're related to me, right? So for them, I think it's the Americanness is what's most salient. And like sort of like how I relate to Indian culture, being someone who's grown up and been born and raised in America, is the thing that they're kind of picking at the hardest. And I think what's really interesting in all of it is that both in my life and in conversation, queerness is actually often the last thing on the list. I don't think there's fault in that, but I think it's an interesting thing where like the racial and geographic features of my identity are so salient and so much to unpack in and of themselves that like queerness rarely comes first in what people are asking me about, or even in what I'm saying to them. It's not the first thing on the list. And also part of that is I came out much later, right? I came out when I was in my late 20s, early 30s. And so for 3/4 of my life, like other things were the parts of my identity I had most effectively named for myself and had done the most work around. And so it's easiest to kind of talk about them first because I've spent a lot more time like actively knowing and sort of being in those identities as opposed to this other part of my identity where like it took a lot longer to figure out like what that all meant. And again, like I think while I didn't have models, a ton of models of like Appalachian Indians, I did have models of folks who were Appalachian, and I did have models of people who were Indian, and I didn't have any models of people who were Appalachian and Indian and queer. And so I think it just has taken a lot longer to integrate that part of self into like my narrative and into the way I sort of describe who I am and where I come from.
Have you met any others who share that kind of similarity in upbringing?
Actually, only in the process of writing this book.
Wonderful.
Yeah, actually, some really cool relationships have sort of formed through the process of writing this book and through the process of telling these stories. And there are some folks who, I'm trying to think if there are any folks who are exactly my age. Like there are a couple of other kids of my generation. We're not kids anymore, but the young people of my generation who have grown up and now are in queer relationships. There are a few of us, but not a lot.
That's great that you've been able to connect with folks. So I'm curious to hear a little more about how you came to your queer identity, if you're willing to talk about that.
Yeah. You know, like I think that for a long time, I really was trying to meet what I felt like were the expectations of my family and my community, which were that I was supposed to marry a Desi man. I think I tried to do that. Like I tried to date Indian men. I did try to do those things. I think even in my own mind, when I imagined like being in a relationship or being married or those things, like I only had the models that I had seen, right? So like in a lot of ways, those were the things that I was trying to do. And it just didn't work. Like it didn't work. I didn't meet anybody I liked that much. Like I didn't feel that connected to anybody. And you know, like I was about to turn 30 and I kind of was like, what the hell am I doing? Like why do I have these like narrow definitions and narrow terms as to like who I want to be in a relationship with if those terms aren't actually serving me? Like I'm not having these like deep, meaningful relationships. I'm just like bouncing really superficially along, and I'm about to be 30, and it's like I can keep doing the things I've been doing, or I can like let my brain be more flexible, and I can let my brain consider possibilities that I hadn't necessarily considered before. And I think it really took kind of giving myself permission to break away. You know, when you were saying the thing about how queerness can be a buffer, it's like it can be if you let it. But you have to let it. And I think I had to let it. I had to be able to let go of like the shoulds of like, this is what you're supposed to do, or this is who you should be with, or this is how this should look. And I think letting go of that took me a long time. I think I felt a lot of pressure for a long time to fit into those shoulds, and had to work really hard to let go of the ideas of like what things should be in order to allow for the possibility that like maybe the thing that was going to make me happiest wasn't any of those things and wasn't actually a thing that anybody I grew up around or knew had ever done that I knew of, right? And maybe they had, but like I didn't know. So I think there was a like an unlearning that had to happen in order to allow for the buffer of living life in a different way.
It's not uncommon for women in their late 20s to have had enough time to figure out that certain things didn't work for them. So I just want to say that because that's something I've heard from a lot of people, including my wife.
That's good to know. I wouldn't say that I knew that. I feel like, you know, working as a teacher, like I'm so amazed by my young people because like I have students who are in 8th and 9th grade who are already so like confident in their identities and so clear that I kind of look at them and I'm like, woo, like I'm slow. This is kind of amazing that you're where you are. And I was like, meanwhile, me like 15 years later was like, oh, maybe I'm doing this all wrong. But glad to hear that I'm not alone in that
No, no,
category.
not at all. And in fact, I noticed this when I was living in New York, dating around that age, and I noticed that a lot of women in their late 20s, early 30s had left their first major serious relationships, sometimes had children, and had come to realize like, oh, I'm much more attracted to women than to men. And so I think it's a really common thing. And also an almost inevitable result of what you described, which is having no reference points, no resources to understand one's own difference or experience. So I think that kids now really have a leg up. I was constantly amazed by the college students that I taught, what they understood about identity and gender and sexuality and consent and myriad other things, how much easier it was for them.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's like we had to go first, right? Somebody had to go first. People have to go first in order for it to get better. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing now, is that enough people have gone first. Enough people have kind of made their journeys like visible that it makes it easier for the people who come after them.
Mm-hmm, exactly. I want to ask you just to say a few words about what you studied at Carnegie Mellon, what you decided to do for your dissertation.
Sure. So, yeah, I was a double major in anthropology and professional writing. And I was a professional writing major because my parents wouldn't let me be a creative writing major, really. They wanted me to do something practical. And they were like, well, professional writing is practical. And I was like a professional writing major in name and then only took creative writing classes, basically. Like, I think I took like whatever the like 2 required ones were for the major, and then everything else was creative writing. And so I actually did a creative writing thesis. And it was a book of essays sort of about like my relationship to India and my family there. And a lot about trying to understand how that place, like how you could be so connected to a place that wasn't your home, like it wasn't where you lived or grew up, but also still was like really informing your identity and really making you think about who you were in the world. And at that point in my life, I was going to India a lot more frequently. Really in my teen years, I was going like every 2 to 3 years. So it was like a place that was really salient for me, in sort of as I tried to parse my identity as like a Desi woman in America. Like I was kind of trying to do that while also looking at like what Desi women in India, like who they were and what it meant to be them, and like trying to think about how do you take that and like transplant it to here, and realizing that like you can't. And realizing also that like I didn't want to, that like when I would go back, like those gendered expectations that like were really being articulated all the time, like in what you're wearing and how you look and what you're doing and like where you can go, who you can be with, like all the, like I really chafed against them. And for me, writing was like, and is like, writing's how I make sense of things. Like a lot of the time when I like sit down to write, I don't have an answer. I have a question. And I'm trying to think about like, how can I answer this question by exploring these like different moments or experiences in my life? How do they help me get closer to an answer to a question that I have about myself or my identity or the world? And so that's really what I was doing in that thesis was trying to answer questions about myself. Like, who am I? Like, what does it mean to be me in the world? And like, what are the messages I've gotten about who I'm supposed to be? And like, what do I think about those messages? And unfortunately, I think that talking about those messages meant talking about other people and their relationships and their gender dynamics. And like now with like lots of retrospect, I can be like, yeah, that was probably a mess. Like I probably shouldn't have done that. Right. But at the time, like I only thought that my thesis advisor and I were going to see those essays. Like they weren't for public consumption. They were for me and for my advisor, and they were really necessary in trying to make sense of my gender identity. And then they got released to the world, and then that was a hot mess.
Yeah. I didn't realize just how Googleable our senior theses were until a little bit later.
No one told me they were going to put that online. Like, what?
Yeah.
and I got in big trouble for writing it. Like, one of a cousin in India found it and shared it with my family, and like they were pissed. And they basically were like, how dare you come here and think these things about us? And like, we don't really want to have a relationship with you anymore. And it probably, I think, was that happened like several years after it was written. Like it happened like 10 years later, right? Like it got written and whatever, put up there, and I didn't even know it was there. But it really was for me like one of the sort of like nail in the coffin moments in terms of making choices of like, who am I going to be loyal to in this moment? Like, am I going to be loyal to myself and my questions? Or am I going to like push that all down for the sake of like not bringing shame to my family? And I ultimately ended up choosing like to be loyal to myself and my questions, which is like a very American choice in some ways. Like it's not the thing that you're supposed to do. It's not what Desi people do, right? You're supposed to put family first, and I put myself first. But I think in some ways it was one of those first choices of saying like, I don't know, like I don't think this is the way for me. And I'm not willing to sort of say I'm sorry and say like that those questions were a mistake, because I don't think those questions were a mistake.
So there was considerable fallout, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Did you say to me, did you make an attempt to repair the relationships?
Yeah, so I went to India and like I apologized, right? Kind of like I asked forgiveness. But like this is also one of those things where like communication, I mean, it's just like we don't have the tools to talk about these things. Like even when you're saying the words like repair harm,
Yeah.
I'm like, I mean, I touch people's feet.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like,
Yes.
I did that. But like, but yeah, it's just like those paradigms like of restoring, like they don't exist.
It's a very hierarchical notion of right and wrong, and
that's right. Right. And like, I actually think like as a woman, like I'm not sure you can. Like, I don't think you're allowed to repair. I think you're just wrong.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Like, you'll just always be wrong. I mean, I haven't been back since then. So I went back in 2013 and I touched everyone's feet and I said I was sorry. And I haven't gone back since, and I'm not going to.
That sounds like a really defining moment.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and I went and I was in a relationship with my partner at that point. And I went and I didn't say, and at that point I was like 32. And, you know, like all that, why are you still not married? Why aren't you, like, you know, all that pressure, all those questions. And like, I didn't talk about my partner and I didn't tell them that I had a partner. And I just sort of like watched. It was Pride when I was there. And like, you know, it was the first televised Pride in India. And I think the first like big celebrations of Pride that had happened. And like, I was watching my family members like watch the coverage on TV and be super homophobic. And, you know, Modi was just like becoming more and more of I should explain better, but Narendra Modi, who's now the Prime Minister of India, is like an Islamophobic tyrant. And he was, before being the Prime Minister of India, he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, which is the state that my family's from. And I had all these family members who were like sycophants about him. And I'm like, what am I doing? Like, why am I coming here? Like, you don't support me. You don't support like ideas or beliefs that I feel okay with. You're saying and doing things that like to me are like completely not okay. And I'm spending like thousands of dollars here to fly here and like sit in your house for what? Like what's it for? Because nothing about this experience aligns with like who I am as a person at this point. And my family has been gone for 50 years. And like, so what are we doing? Like, what is the going back for? It's like trying to go back and connect with something where I just think that connection, it's not actually there anymore. And that's hard, but I think that's what it means to immigrate. I think on some level, like when you immigrate, it is very hard to preserve and maintain like the sense of identity that someone might have had when they actually lived in that place. And I think for kids of immigrants, then the expectation that you continue to like preserve that even as your identity is getting further and further and further away, it just sort of feels impossible.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple things I want to ask. From our conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago, this idea of what will people say has been sitting with me, and what kind of an influence that could exert. And it sounds like during this viewing of the televised Pride Parade, you got a sense of what people are afraid people would say because your own family was saying it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Not only what will people say, but what do people think? Which is worse in a way, right? It's like, it wasn't even like they were weighing in on a thing that was directly in front of them. They were like seeing people they didn't even know, like celebrating on a TV screen, and like that was enough to elicit this reaction, right? And a more generous view might be to say, well, like, oh, but maybe they would react differently if it was you, and it wasn't just people on a TV screen. And like that's possible, but if you're gonna act that way towards people you don't know, like, am I okay with that? No. Right? It shouldn't be that the only reason you're okay with it is because it's me. Like that's not, I think that is how things happen. And also I don't think that's how things should happen. I think people are deserving of our humanity and our compassion, like whether we know them or not. And so watching that lack of compassion, just for me felt like, okay, I can't, these things, like I can't reconcile them anymore. Like I don't know how to reconcile the vertical identity of thisness that my parents have passed down to me that is manifesting in these like really Islamophobic and homophobic and transphobic ways, with my horizontal identity of being a queer brown person. I don't know how to make them live together. And so like I have to create some distance between them because it is, I mean, maybe there's someone who knows how to do this better than me. There probably are people who do, but like, I don't know how you hold both of those things in the same place when what people are saying is about effectively you. And when they're expressing a kind of loathing about people like you, and you're like, no, but I am that person. Like I could be that person on that screen just as easily. I think there's some like self-preservation that kicks in there to be like, we can't do this.
So it sounds like you, similarly to me, have decided not to have relationships with people who still live there and, frankly, think a certain way.
Yeah, and it's not like everyone is like that, right? Like I definitely have some family members who are in India who are super supportive, like will send emails, be like, how are you doing? Like it's not like I have cut off everyone. And I haven't like made an announcement to people like, you're cut off. But I think I have created space, like in the choices I make around who I communicate with and who I don't, and how I communicate, and in the fact that I haven't gone back in 8 years. Like that's a choice. That choice communicates something, right? So ultimately, like, sure, are you still my friend on Facebook? Okay, yeah, but can you see anything? No. And am I gonna come see you? No. So. Right? Like you can create space in ways, without the finality of a like, I'm never speaking to you again. There are lots of ways to create that space and to just say like, I don't have to go here. And I think it's really painful for my mom. Like, I think it's very hard for her. But I also think I don't feel like she totally understands, what it means to be me. And she can't because she's not me. But I think it's hard for her that I've made these choices. Like she really wants me to go back. And she really wants me to maintain those connections. And I just think our emotional energy is not an unlimited supply. And it's important to save it for like the places and the spaces and the people who show you love. And not to expend it all on places where there's not that feeling.
Especially given that as queer brown people in this period, in this day and age, I feel like we deal with quite enough.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like the world is like a loving place, right? Yeah, no, I would agree, right? It's like, there's enough negativity everywhere. I don't need to add more. Like, ultimately, I think that it's not an easy choice, but it's the choice that I feel like I've made.
Are you willing to share your process of coming out to your family?
So it was definitely not linear. And it wasn't all at once. I think that I heard someone say once, like, people, when you're coming out, you come out again, 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 again. Like, it's not like a one-time thing.
Starting with to yourself.
Right, exactly. But I think that's definitely something that resonated for me. My sister was the first person I told. I think I mentioned earlier, she's 7 years older than I am, and she's always kind of been my buffer. Like, she always, when I was going to try to do something that ran against expectation, like, she would often kind of go out first for me and try to sort of like kind of shield me from what was going to come. And that happened with this too. Like, I came out to her first. It kind of all came out in a rush. I was just like, I need to tell you something, and I did. And she was amazing and like supportive and super loving, and then really helped me to sort of like think about how I would have the subsequent conversations. And the next conversation I had after my sister was with my mom. And it was probably a couple months later. And it was, my mom had met my partner, kind of like, again, as like, oh, this is my friend. And that this is probably my fault that this blame this entire paradigm on me. It's my fault. But I remember I was like at the dining table, and I was like, I gotta tell you something. And I told her that I was in a relationship with my partner, and her response was like that she just wanted me to be happy. And that she didn't want life to be harder for me, which I think lots of they see. Yeah. Like, I think that's a very familiar line. And I can, in retrospect, appreciate and understand that, like, I get where you're coming from. And it's also hard when you can't be all of who you are, right? But you can't see that part if you're not the person. So, yeah, like, in the scheme of responses, like, again, given how far outside her schema, I think that it was. And I should say, like, my family didn't, like, in West Virginia in the 80s and 90s, like, there were not very many queer people who were visible. It doesn't mean there weren't queer people, but I think a lot of folks were living, like, in ways that weren't, like, publicly out to everyone, right? They might have been out to their family, they might have been out to their friends, but, like, my parents didn't know any gay people.
We grew up during the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Right. So, like, they didn't. So, like, me telling my mom this was like the first queer person she'd ever met was me. And so I think, her responses have to be thought about in that context. Like, if I'm the first person you've ever met, like, you don't have schema. Like, you don't know what it means or what the implications are. Like, you're just thinking about your child and you want the best for your child. And then from there, it got really interesting because then my mom sort of was like, oh, well, I want to tell people. And I was like, And part of me was like, well, maybe that's easier. And part of me was like, I don't know if I want people to know. Like, I mean, I don't know how this is all going to go down. But effectively, like, my dad and I don't have a very communicative relationship. And I was like, I don't even know what that's going to look like. I think I sent my dad an email. I'm pretty sure. And I don't think he wrote back.
Wow.
I mean, I think it was like that. And not like he didn't write back in some negative way. I think he just
I understand that. I understand that. I understand this thing.
Like, noted.
Of saying something and having it be absorbed and that being the communication.
Right. Exactly. That was a communication. Yeah. And then it was a really strange thing where I think she did tell some family members. I don't know how many family members she's told. But it definitely felt like it sort of like spun out of my control a little bit at that point. And then it wasn't as much about me sharing it as about like her need for a narrative around it, or like how she wanted people to hear it. Which is what it is. It, like, I think, yeah, I mean, I do think there was probably a need to like have a narrative. And I don't totally know what the narrative was, right? But like I think there needed to be a narrative. And then in terms of my family here, like I like Laura went with me to like different events. Like I basically just introduced her to people, and by and large my family here has been like really great and like really, just like always want to know how she's doing, like, always ask, always check in, like always invite her to family things. But I think for family in India, my mom definitely did have a need to be the one to share. And again, like it's an interesting space where it's like, okay, well, like if you being the one to share is how you're able to like preserve or maintain your sort of like power dynamic or your understanding of the nature of those relationships, like I get it. And as I've sort of made choices about where I'm going to go and not go, like, I don't really feel like I have claim to that space. Like, I'm not like, oh, I need to be the one to tell those people because I'm not really going back there. So it's been okay with me to kind of be like, yeah, like, go for it, But when in an Indian wedding or a Desi wedding of any kind, like, you invite everyone and their mother. Like when we got married, like we didn't invite most people. Like we invited like the people who meant the most to us in terms of our relationship with each other. And that meant that like for both of us, it wasn't a lot of family who were there. Not like blood family, right? It was like chosen family. It was the people who are in our lives, in our day to day, and show up for us all the time. Like that's who we wanted to be there.
I continue my conversation with Neema in the next episode, starting with how she and her wife had a surprise wedding. We also talk about her activism and what ultimately led her to write her book. You can learn more about Neema and read some of her writing at her website, www.neemaavashia.com. I will put the link to her website and her Twitter handle in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.